Thank you, Christopher. It was a year ago this month, actually, that Caroline and I made a decision. I wouldn't say a regrettable one. We just kind of figured this is part of the growing up experience for our children. And we bought a puppy, and she's this little white cloud of a dog, and she's got tan ears, and we named her Flower Pot. And Flower Pot is as sweet a dog as she could possibly be. And there's not one hint of meanness in that dog. I mean, her only aspirations in life are to be loved on and to be fed. And as much as we love Flower Pot and love having Flower Pot, she's an inside dog, and so there's some headaches that come with that. The greatest of which is that you've got to take them outside so that they can go to the bathroom. So regularly throughout the day, we take Flower Pot out. That poses, though, some aggravation with her. Our backyard is fenced in, and so what's nice, especially if the weather's pleasant enough, you can just open the back door and set her out, and you can just leave her out there for a little while, and she'll run around, she'll do her business, and she'll just enjoy being outside. But then you'll go to get her back in the house, and she may be even seated there at the back door, ready to come in, and you'll open the door for her to come in, and she'll just sit there and look at you. She will not come in until you first step out. And then she comes in. It's as if this dumb little dog is thinking ladies first. Don't you get that? Anyway, so that's a little aggravating with her. But more aggravating is when you need to get her to go to the bathroom in short order. So let's say you're getting ready to go somewhere. You're going to be gone for a period of hours. You need her to go outside and do her business, and time is of consequence. So you get her outside, and she's running around. She does her thing. And at this point, you're ready to get her back in the house. So you say, "Come on, Flower Pot." She's looking at you like, "Who? Me? Why the rush? Aren't we boys?" And so you call her and she just won't come to you. And so at that point you begin to walk towards her with the hope that maybe you can grab her and pick her up. But the closer you get, the more that causes her to run in the opposite direction from where you are. And so chasing her or calling out to her is not working. And so a lot of times what I'll do at this point is to go to the back door and open it. And I'll say, "See, Flower Pot, the door's open. I'm standing outside, ladies first." And she's like, "Having a good time here. There's no need to rush, no need to hurry. Fools rush in, after all." And so she continues to run around and frolic and do her thing. And I'm trying to get her to go in. I'm calling her. I'm opening the door for her. Still, she's not coming in. And sometimes what I'll do then is to try to show her by example. And I will walk in, and then I will stand there inside the door. "See, Flower Pot, come on in. Come on, baby. Let's go. And still, she does not come. Still, she does not follow. If we're honest, too many of us as believers are living lives that in many ways mirror my experience of trying to get Flower Pot back in the house. And that is that we may be going a direction, going down a path, and wanting others to go down that path as well, but they're not doing so. They are not following our lead. They are not taking note of our example. And too many of us as believers are effectively living lives completely of isolation and void of influence. I want you to understand that in Jesus' own words, He said of us as believers that we are both salt and light in this dark culture. And we are to be salt and light in influencing and exercising and expressing influence in our culture. And quite frankly, there ought to be those that are looking at us, taking note of the lives that we lead and the morals that we possess and the disciplines that we are maintaining and the relationship with God that we have. They ought to be taking note of that, and some of them deciding, "I want to follow that." But too many of us are just all by ourselves. We are effectively lone rangers. This morning we continue in a series that we just started last week on the life of the Old Testament character Saul, a series that I've entitled Lone Rangers. And just for today, this series is going to take a slightly different direction because this is going to be kind of the one Sunday that Saul gets something right. And throughout the course of his reign, though, you see him operating as a guy that's saying, okay, God, I've got things from here. I don't need your help. But in this instance, we see Saul getting something right. And as he's getting something right, he serves as an answer to us for this simple question. What does it take for you? What does it take for me to be a person of influence? What does it take for you as a child of God to live in such a way that people take note and actually are following? Well, what does it take? Well, it's going to require you being willing to say three things that we see in 1 Samuel chapter 11. If you would open your Bibles there with me, 1 Samuel chapter 11. We're going to actually go through this entire chapter, and so for time's sake, we won't read it all. We're going to drop in and you'll, you'll get the story. For us today, though, again, the question is, what does it take for me, for you, for us collectively to be people, to be individuals of influence? Well, we need to be willing to say three things, and the first is this: do as I am doing. You've got to be willing to say, do as I am doing. At this point, Saul has now been anointed by Samuel, the prophet of God, as Israel's first king. God has further confirmed this by anointing Saul with his Spirit. He is now the king, and he has been revealed. We saw that last week. He's been revealed to the nation, introduced to them as their first king. And still, though, this is in the early phases of a monarchy being established, a centralized government being formed, and so Saul is still back at his home. We'll see later he's still out plowing his own fields. But as chapter 11 begins, we're introduced to a man named Nahash. We're told he's an Ammonite, and he camped up and camped against Jabesh Gilead. Jabesh Gilead was a city in the area of the tribe of Manasseh, on the eastern outskirts of it. And what has happened is that a man named Nahash, who is the king of the nation of Ammon, gets his armies together and they set up camp right outside the city. The indication or the implication is clear. They intend on assaulting or launching an attack on this city, and he plans on taking it by force. The citizens of Jabesh Gilead are aware of what threat is now looming. And so they think, and they have the idea, hey, we ought to see if we can negotiate a peace treaty so that maybe our lives can be spared and we'll still be able to keep our homes and farms and all that stuff. So they send messengers to Nahash with the extension of an olive branch. Hey, let's have a peace treaty. Let's just kind of get along. Can we do that? You don't have to kill us. Let's come up with a different solution. And so Nahash responds with the conditions of any such treaty. Well, part of the condition was that this city was going to then become his city, part of the kingdom of Ammon. These are going to then be his subjects and his citizens. Well, what do citizens do? Citizens, among other things, have to pay taxes. And so as he issues the conditions of this treaty, he informs them that one of the conditions is that they're going to all have to have their right eyes plucked out. So everybody's going to lose an eye. And though it seems kind of gruesome and gory, it was a proposition that kind of makes at least pragmatic sense for Nahash to demand. First of all, if he were to have them pluck all their eyes out, both of their eyes out, well, these people can't work. They can't farm the land. They can't generate income. They can't pay taxes. So let's leave them one eye so that they can still plow the fields. All right, so that makes sense. But furthermore, it makes sense that since they are going to be a dominated people, they're going to become subjects and slaves to the king of Ammon, it stands to reason that at some point they may decide, we don't like this. We want to overthrow this oppression. And so Nahash is thinking, well, it's a lot more difficult to fight with one eye than it is with two, so I'll just leave them the one. So from his standpoint, from his perspective, this is a great deal. Their lives get spared. He gets the income. He gets the slaves. He gets the territory. Well, the citizens of Jabesh Gilead ask for a week. They say, we need some time to think about this. So they ask for a week before they respond. And at that point, they send word of all of this throughout the nation of Israel in hopes that somebody or some people from their own nation are going to come to their aid. Well, this message we see by the time it gets down to verse 5, Saul is out plowing his fields. And these messengers come up, and he asks the question, "What troubles you? Why do you weep?" And they told him the words of the men of Jabesh. So they paint the picture for what's going on. Well, Saul hears this, and his response is noteworthy on a couple of fronts. It says in verse 6, the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard this news, and his anger was greatly aroused. Verse 7, he took a yoke of oxen, he cut them into pieces and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hands of messengers, saying, "Whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel to battle, so it shall be done to his oxen." All right, so Saul hears this, and this is his first real executive action as Israel's first king, his first foray into leadership as their king. And he's posed with this dilemma. What should we do? We've had this peace treaty that has been offered or extended by the Ammonites. What should we do? Saul hears this, and again, his response is noteworthy on a couple of fronts. First of all, upon hearing it, he takes a yoke of oxen and he butchers them, kills them, slaughters them, and takes bits of the carcass, and he's going to send it with messengers throughout the nation of Israel with this stern warning. This is going to happen to all of your oxen if you don't show up and fight. Now, when Saul hears this, the conditions of this treaty in his mind, he thinks with such a wonderful, clear discernment. He's recognizing this deal stinks. This is not conditions of a peace treaty. This is unmitigated surrender. An offer like this is absolutely going to be refused, and a threat like this will not stand. What's amazing is the clear discernment that Saul is demonstrating here, and how clearly he recognizes and stands up communicating what is right and what is wrong. That's noteworthy because in 2014, it is such an absent practice in our society and culture. Too many times what we do is content ourselves to get in our huddle groups on Sunday mornings, and we get in here and we sing the songs of Zion, and we pray and we give and we listen and we serve and we do all of these things. But then when we get out in the world, when we leave this place, we're essentially turtles that draw back into the shell. And then we lament the drift of society and the drift of culture and what we see in the entertainment field, what we see in the news field, what we see in the sports field, what we see collectively on the moral front. Consistently, we're seeing things that God has said, that is wrong. And what do? We are raising not simply a generation of spineless Americans, we are raising collectively among evangelicals generations of mamby-pamby Christians that will not stand up and say, this is what God said, and God said that's wrong. Thankfully, Saul, at least this time, he gets this right. He says, that is wrong and it will not stand. We need that today. But there's something else that he does. It's easy to miss. You see it in verse 6. Actually in verse 7. He has cut up these pieces of the oxen. He's distributing them, this bloody mess going everywhere. It's terrible. But with this messenger. And the messenger has the message, whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel to battle, so it shall be done to his oxen. The part that's interesting, you can easily pass over this, is when he says, whoever does not go out with Samuel and Saul. Isn't this interesting? Here is the king of a nation. There's some perks to be king. One of the perks is that you get to issue orders and people have to do as you say. Very easily, Saul could have said, you're going to get up and you're going to fight because the king has just decreed so. But Saul is issuing this call, this invitation to join him. It wasn't merely him saying, do as I say. He was saying to them, listen, be a part of this. Do as I am doing. It's very different, isn't it? If you want to be, and if you aspire to be a believer, a child of God that is influential, that people take note of, and that people to varying degrees are following the lead and the example that you are setting, it is going to require you not just sitting back and barking orders and saying, well, that's wrong, and you ought to be doing this, and you ought to get up and do that. It ought to be, an invitation, do as I am also doing. I remember a few years ago, I had gone to the doctor to get what was the first physical I'd gotten in 13 years. I mean, when you're a specimen like this, anyway, yes, thank you, Howard. You understand. Anyway, so it had been 13 years since I'd had a physical. I knew it was long overdue, and I actually scheduled this with, my doctor was busy, so the PA actually did this. And you know how it is when you go to a physical, the first thing you do is you step on the scales. They'll check your blood pressure. The doctor does this physical examination, and then they'll typically review some of their findings or some of their observations before then they'll send you to the lab for blood and urine work. So anyway, but before the PA has sent me to the lab, she sits down and she starts to talk with me. And among the things that she begins to describe to me is, she says, okay, according to this is how much you weigh. And then she reaches over and there's a folder on the cabinet and she pulls out this chart. And she said, all right, this is how much you weigh and this is how tall you are. So based on your height and your weight, that puts you into the obese category. You like the sound of the word obese? I mean, I'd rather be called dumb than obese. I'd rather be called fat than obese. Obese sounds so big. And so she's telling me that I need to lose weight. I am in, at least according to this chart, I am in the obese category. I need to lose weight. So she's telling me this. As she's saying this to me, I'm not thinking about possible diet regimens and the beginning of an exercise plan or, quite frankly, any of that stuff. This is what I'm thinking. The woman that is telling me this would come in, tip the scale somewhere, or I'm guessing around 275. And it's okay, in terms of weight categories, to weigh 275 if you're about 12'3". She's about 5'5". Miss PA, she could use some jumping jacks. And she's telling me I am in the obese category and I need to lose some weight. All I can think is, not as much as you. All right, so she's telling me, this is what I need to do. I need to lose weight. I need to exercise. I need to do all this stuff. And you know what? I didn't do any of that. Not one bit, at least at that point. I didn't do one bit of that. And everything that she said relative to this, I completely brushed off. You know why? Because I thought, she's not doing a bit of this. She's telling me, do as I say, not as I do. Listen, if you want to be a lone ranger, going about doing your thing, that is exerting no influence and not living a life of consequence where people are taking note of and following the example that you're setting, if you don't want that, well then fine, disregard everything else I'm saying today. But if you aspire to be that, because that's what God wants for you, salt and light does that. They have that type of influence. And if you want to be a person of influence, you've got to be willing to say, not simply do as I say, but do as I am doing. But there's something else that we see here in Saul's example that we've got to be willing to say, and that is that the right costs. Be willing to say that the right costs. Saul has just heard the conditions of this treaty. He says this will not stand. He sends the message throughout the nation, hey, this is what's going to happen to your oxen if you don't join us in this fight. All right, so you think about those that are going to be receiving this message from Saul. They are being told, and they're seeing tangible proof of what a butchered, wasted ox looks like. And so they're evaluating their options. They can go and fight or they can stay at home. They stay at home, they lose their oxen. Now, this is an agricultural society. Everything is contingent on the success of the farm. Their livelihoods, their ability to eat and sustain themselves, everything is contingent on the farm. There's no tractors, there's no heavy farm equipment, there's nothing. And so to lose your oxen is to lose a tremendously valuable commodity. You lose those, you could lose your livelihood. You lose those, it may be that you and your family could starve to death. So they're faced with these options. Option one is stay home and not fight. Then you lose your oxen. You may starve. You may lose your home. You may go belly up. Option 2 is to actually go and fight. You're aware that when you go and fight a war, the objective is pretty simple. Kill them before they kill you. And as you're trying to kill them, they're trying to kill you back, right? So going to fight a war means potentially, or certainly at least, you're exposing your life to risk. You could lose your life. So here they have these two options. Stay at home, lose their livelihood, potentially lose their homes, or go off and fight and maybe lose their life. Two options, two choices from which they can make a decision. From Saul's perspective, clearly there was a right answer, and the right answer, the right thing to do, was to get up, to man up, and go fight. Defend this city, defend their territory, defend their nation against this threat of oppression. That was the right thing to do. The wrong thing was to stay at home. And Saul was telling him, if you choose the wrong thing, it's going to cost you. But in presenting these options, he's not only saying that the wrong thing will cost, he's also saying that doing the right thing also can cost. You know, typically we only operate with half of that notion at play in our mind, that doing the wrong thing will cost you. As parents of especially young children, and those of you that can remember these days, you're aware of the fact this is something that continuously we are demonstrating to our children. You do the wrong thing and it's going to cost you. I remember when Nathan was probably, I'm going to say a year and a half, 2 years, maybe a little over 24 months. We were back in Charlotte. I don't even remember if Andrew was born at that time. And we had in our den, there was a couch and a love seat. Next to the love seat, there was an end table. On top of the table, there was this lamp. And also on that table, there were probably, 4 or 5 books standing up with bookends on either side. And one day, Nathan had gone over messing with those books and knocked them over, which in turn knocked the lamp over. It had one of those compact fluorescent bulbs in it, and so that bulb shatters everywhere. We've got glass everywhere. Those CFLs also have mercury in them, and then you're supposed to call the hazmat crew or something to clean it up. We get a dustpan and a vacuum. Anyway, so we get all this mess cleaned up, and clearly at this point we need to be paying attention if Nathan is anywhere near those books or that lamp. And so it was a day or two later, and I was seated there at the end of the love seat next to this end table. And Caroline is over on the couch. Nathan comes by, and he seeks to reach out with his little hands to mess with these books. I said, Nathan, no, don't touch those books. He looks at me like... and then reaches out to grab them again. And I said more firmly, Nathan, do not touch those books. I don't want to go through all this stuff again. And again, he just ignores it and reaches out for them. This time I actually stop and block his hands. But even then, he will not be assuaged. And the 4th time, he reaches out again. At that time, I grabbed that little paw of his and I popped it. And immediately he melted into a puddle of tears. Just sobbing. It's one of those that you see it before you hear it, right? So at that point, his little hand is hurting, and so he is sobbing, and he needs his mommy. So he turns to run towards Caroline, and doing so, he trips and hits his head on the coffee table to add insult to injury. It could not have been more traumatic for a little guy than it was for him that day. But you know what? Nathan never touched those books again. In fact, I think he hates libraries to this day. He never touched those books again because we had communicated, if you do the wrong thing, there's going to be a cost to be borne. But consistently as parents, we teach the opposite of that thought, which is that if you're doing the right thing, then everything goes well. You don't get into trouble, doesn't cost you anything, things go well if you do the right thing. The problem is that thought diminishes really what I believe is the true nature of the gospel and the true nature of the Christian life. Too many times we paint this rosy picture of the life of the believer where we have this relationship with God that is real and deeply personal, that is loving, that is gracious, and it provides guidance, and it does all these things for us. And though that is true, it is only half of the equation, because this relationship with this God that is deeply real and is deeply personal, it is also a relationship where He's in charge and you're not. And because He's in charge and you're not, He gets to place upon you expectations. He gets to erect for you standards. He gets the ability to tell you that it's not your will but mine, to forego your dreams, your personal aspirations, your particular preferences or ambitions. That having this relationship with God and doing the right thing, there is absolutely a cost to that. We need to be honest as believers, honest with ourselves and honest with those outside the faith, and be honest in communicating to them, man, it's going to cost you to do the wrong thing, but the truth is also there's a price to be paid for having a relationship with God. There are sacrifices that He's going to place upon you. There's prices that He's going to expect you to pay. We need to be honest in saying that the right costs. The wrong does. It costs. The right, there's also a price to it. But here's the kicker. The benefits, they're out of this world. We need to be, if we're going to be people of influence, those that are willing to say, do as I am doing. We need to be willing to say the right cost, but there's a final thing, and that is very simply this. If you want to be a person of influence, be willing to say, I forgive. I forgive. For this to make sense, you need to actually go back to verse 27 of chapter 10. At this point, Saul has just been revealed to the nation of Israel. Samuel has just said, hey, here's your king. It's Saul, the son of Kish. Now, in verse 24, the people respond to this news by saying, long live the king. Almost everyone says this. Beyond that, what they then begin to do is to take gifts and trinkets and valuable items to go and present to Saul as an expression to him of their gratitude for being their king. But verse 27 says that some said, how can this man save us? So they despised him, and they brought him no presents. But Saul held his peace. It's kind of clear when everybody or almost everybody gets up to give you a present, if there's some that are seated at the back that just sit there with their arms crossed. This doesn't go unnoticed by Saul. He recognizes it but doesn't say it. All right, so you fast forward to chapter 11. Saul has issued this invitation for people to join him. And 330,000 Israelites join with Saul and say, all right, we're going to go fight. At this point, he divides them into three regiments of I'm assuming 110,000 apiece. That way they're able to launch an attack from the front, but also cover their right and left flanks. They began to attack the Nahash and his armies, this king of Ammon. And it is an amazing, an astounding victory that the Israelites have. A complete rout of their enemy. And in fact, the losses were so great by the nation of Ammon that the Bible tells us in this chapter that the survivors were so few that they could not walk in pairs. It was just one here and one there. I mean, it was an astounding victory, tremendous victory. And so at this point, Saul and the people are relishing this great victory that they have experienced. In verse 12 of chapter 11, the people said to Samuel, who is he who said, shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men that we may put them to death. All right, so Saul, this is his first foray into leadership. This is his first time to lead his forces out into battle. And they've had this great victory. And now after this victory, people are saying, who were those naysayers? Who was it that was questioning Saul? Who was it that despised him in the first place? Let's kill him. What's Saul's response? You see it in verse 13. He says, not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished salvation in Israel. It's good that he recognizes that God gave the victory. It wasn't his battlefield strategy. It wasn't the weapons that they had. It wasn't any of those things. It was God that gave them the victory. But here you've got people that they just didn't simply call into question or doubt, but to call into question publicly, to doubt publicly, to express contempt publicly, to castigate publicly, not just anybody, but the king. And so now people are saying, who are those people? Let's round them up and let's execute them. Let's be done with them today. And Saul, he's the king, and it is completely within his rights and his abilities as the king to be able to say, all right, get a rope. Let's go ahead and take care of this. But Saul doesn't do that. He says nobody is going to die. It was perfectly within his rights to have all of these people executed, but Saul doesn't hold it against them. Saul forgives them. John Wesley is one of the great theologians of Protestant Christianity. He is joined historically by his brother Charles, the great hymn writer. One day a man said to John Wesley, though, I will never forgive and I will never forget. And so John Wesley just simply said in response to him, I hope then that you never sin. I hope then that you never sin. The simple truth is that unfortunately, we may act like islands sometimes unto ourselves. None of us is an island, and we are living this life among people. And as you seek to be a person of influence, that God is able to work through you to set an example for others to take note of and to follow, you're going to be having people that are taking note of you, and you're living among other people. And as this happens and as life unfolds, the reality is that at various points, you're going to do something that may generate an offense. You may in some way sin against them. And when that day comes, the simple question is this: how can you expect them to forgive you if you're not willing to forgive them? Listen, the person that is an individual, a man or a woman of godly influence, is somebody that doesn't say, hey, I told you so. They simply say, I forgive you. In Philippians chapter 3, Paul says in verse 17, brothers, join in imitating me and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. Paul was aware of the fact that to varying degrees, every single one of us is paying attention to and to varying degrees following the example of others. And Paul was not saying, hey, I'm perfect, I've got everything down jot and tittle. Rather, he was saying this: I'm not perfect, but I want you to take note of how I'm living and others who are living like me and follow our lead. Saul did not want to be a lone ranger. He wanted to be a follower of God of consequence, a follower of God of influence. You don't have to have position or office to be a leader, to be a person of influence. But you do have to be someone that is living in such a way that people take note of you. And your life and what you are saying and what you are willing to say leads them to make a decision that you are an example that's actually beyond just worth taking note of, but actually following. So I conclude today with this very simple question: do you have any who justifiably are following your life and your Christian walk? Or are you just a lone ranger? If the answer is that you're just a lone ranger, are you willing to start saying these things? Do as I am also doing. The right costs. I forgive. If you're willing to say that, God can begin to use your life to count, to use your life to influence. Won't you bow your heads with me?